All right, folks. How we going? Let's hope that music is pretty much on the money. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Open Source History and Terminology. It's Open Source Hackfest, and we are going to be giving you a wonderful rundown of all of the marvelous, weird, and wacky things that you will find in open source, both the background and then diving into a whole bunch of stuff around terminology. Terminology in this case mostly being all those acronyms that you said tend to get thrown around, OSS, Git, all of that jazz. But then also some slightly more esoteric stuff, which should be a bunch of fun. If you have any questions as we go, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'll be more than happy to pick stuff up as we work through here. And otherwise, just roll along, have some fun, learn some new things. So, first up, hey, I'm John. I am one of the coaches here at Major League Hacking. I have been kicking around since around 2014-ish. Was the point I started hacking. I've been organizing for then. That means I'm almost about to go on 10 years of hackathon related stuff, which is absolutely insane to me. Outside of this, I do various arts related stuff. I fly small planes, and I love hardware hacking to an absurd degree. So what are we going to touch on? Well, we're going to have a look at a few different things today. We're going to talk not just about like why these things matter in terms of getting involved, like becoming a contributor, but also like the other side of it, in terms of like the why and what of open source, how we're actually, what is open source? What is it to you? What is it to the people who actually end up using it? We're going to touch a little bit on the history of open source in terms of where it came from, what the modern approaches are to open source, and how it ends up working in practice. We're going to talk about what it looks like today. We're going to talk about different kinds. We're going to talk about what FOSS and COSS are, and the variations within that. We're going to talk a little bit around like the legal side of things, in terms of both getting involved and how it works in practice. And then we'll talk a little bit around like metrics and also non-code contributions. So should be pretty chill. So open source, where did it start? Well, that is pretty simple. It comes basically off of the concept of free sharing of information, which is a thing that's been around way before we were doing it with computers. There's a great example here. This is like the really early days of cars. There was one particular guy called George B. Selden, who owned the rights to the 2-cycle gasoline engine. And this guy basically held a hammer over the heads of everybody else in the entire car industry, because he held the patent for it. And he was a patent troll, effectively. The guy didn't actually like do anything. They weren't making cars, but they were able to force all the car manufacturers to either pay them or risk getting sued by them because they owned the rights to the engine. And then in 1911, for context, this is 1895, so it takes until 1911 for Henry Ford, yes, that one, to win a challenge against this patent. And the result of that was that the patent became invalid, and that information ended up in the free market as it should be. And that's like a great example of this in practice, and there's like taking a concept, and that concept was like locked down for many years, and then it was thrown out into the world, and suddenly after Ford wins that patent, the entire world of cars just opens up, and everybody is flying around in all kinds of fancy automobiles as they should be. But that's all great and good. What about like open source? What's the first real example of that? And I think in this case, I'd say it's got to be the A2 system, which is like a really old operating system. This is, we're talking like early 1950s here, 52, 53. Developed by the UNIVAC division of Remington Rand, which is a lot of fun. very. This is when we say UNIVAC here, we're talking about like UNIVAC was the first computer that really became a household name, I'd say. It was built by the folks who built the ENIAC, which was the like how do I put this? It was like the first programmable computer. It was a result of like a bunch of US World War II funding. But the VAC part of that specifically ties back to vacuum tubes. And the open source label here was created at a strategy session that was held around 1998 in Palo Alto, shortly after the release of Netscape's source code. So we're going all the way back to Netscape Navigator here in terms of timing. And it was Netscape that really kind of kicked off like the open source movement in terms of that. A lot of it does come back to browsers, and we have like the open source Mozilla project, which eventually then cascades into Firefox. And the fun fact of this actually is that Mozilla is actually a combination of two words, which is Mosaic and Godzilla, which was Mosaic being the code name at the time for Netscape Navigator, which was a ton of fun. A neat little detail for the world. So that's all well and good, but what does it look like? Well, here is the current state of affairs. In a lot of cases, open source is being used really, really widely. Red Hat is saying that about enterprises using around 29% of their software as open source. In a lot of software places, I'd imagine that's much, much larger. And 89% of those see enterprise open source as more secure or as secure as proprietary software, which is really, really great, because one of the biggest benefits, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, is like the fact that it is maintained by a much wider group of people, and therefore you're much more likely to find security vulnerabilities and patch them earlier in the cycle. At least compared to alternative setups. So we've got that. GitHub, talking in terms of like raw numbers, when we were up into like close to a 500 million contributions in terms of open source projects. 85 million new projects started globally just in 2022, and that number has only been climbing since then. And around 30% of Fortune 100s have an OSPO. So fun question for chat here. What is an OSPO? And you're not allowed to Google it. Are you familiar with this term? I'm going to guess that a fair few folks are not, because up until I started working in open source in large orgs, I did not know what this meant either. What this means in practice is Open Source Program Office, which basically means that when you get into like large enterprise, you basically have a group within the organization that is specifically focused on dealing with open source stuff. And that can be really, really helpful. They can sort of help push the bar in terms of open sourcing your own stuff internally, but they can also help in relation to like just lots of problem solving. They're really good folks to have around. And the fact that 30% of major Fortune 100s now have one of these is really, really solid. So let's take a step back here and kind of like ask the obvious question, which is like, why would you trust open source? Because let's be honest, like for a lot of people, they're like, well, all of the source code is public, so therefore it's going to be a massive problem because people can see all of my stuff. And in practice, it doesn't really work out like that. If anything, it's usually the opposite with security, especially, is that when you get folks with really varied skill sets and like very different ways to approach a problem, and you pull them all together, you end up with significantly better security standards and also faster response times to security issues. because what you end up with is an entire community of people who are capable of finding vulnerabilities and fixing problems, rather than it just being the one tiny team that you've got in the basement working on that particular tool. Um, Also, similarly, with those groups, you get to share maintenance cost. You can solve all of those like big enterprise problems, because you're not going to be the only person having that problem. You can spread the load across multiple different organizations that might be experiencing the same issues, and have all of those folks throw in, which again usually means that you end up with a better solution overall, because you don't have to just like write a thing that's very specific to you and then deal with all of the maintenance for that. You can leverage the knowledge of all of the different folks who are working on it, which is wonderful. Um, More than that, you also have the ability to really start small. You don't have to do all of the work to get your entire project off the ground. You can like put all of the pieces together initially, and then you can be like, "Hey, I've got this awesome thing. Throw it out there," and then folks can jump on and sort of help you out. So it doesn't end up just being a thing that you have to maintain yourself as one person. You get to kind of help build a community to grow that project and like deal and like stably scale it over time. Um, and in a lot of cases, especially with orgs that do a lot of open source work, like because community is the fundamental backbone of that, there's always a better chance of you finding talent to hire into your organization off the back of open source contributions. Like if you're like, as an example, if you're HashiCorp, or you are you're I mean, less GitHub, because ironically they don't tend to have a lot of open source. I don't think. Chunks here and there, but not that much. Like if you're like HashiCorp, for example, and you have a bunch of folks who are really like contributing really awesome open source stuff to Terraform, for example, you might want to hire those folks because they know exactly what they're doing with the thing that you're building, which is always great. So I've named a couple there. But can you, in fact, yes, you in chat, name some open source projects? What are your favorite open source projects? What are the things that you use on a daily basis that you just really like the communities of, that you find like do open source really well? Linux, yep, that's always the top line. Very well known OSS project. We'll wait to see if we have a few other jump through. GIMP, yep, excellent piece of kit. For any of our image editing friends, actually, GIMP has gotten really good recently. Actually, I mean, I know there's a lot of folks who sort of like used it back in the day, but GIMP has like turned into this absurdly like fantasy artwork creation tool, as well as just doing all of the usual stuff. And also has quite a lot of cross compatibility with Inkscape, which is also an open source project and a really awesome vector graphics editor. Chromium, yep. Chromium, kind of an interesting one, because Chromium is like the engine that then all of the other browsers sort of ended up using, which is quite fun, with the exception of a couple. But that I'd say is a really big example of a success in open source, is that like Chromium is fundamentally like almost the standard for web rendering now, and that is almost entirely on the basis of the fact that it's open source. Like I don't think you could find another project that sort of compares to that in terms of scale. OpenVDB, I am not sure what that is. I'm guessing. Oh, this is fun. This is like open source. Is this open source volumetrics? Oh, it is. Oh, this is nice. Suite of tools for efficient storage and manipulation of sparse volumetric data. Oh, that's very cool. Did this win an Academy Award? Quite possibly. That's very cool. There's actually, it's always fun when you see software that wins like big fancy awards as well, because I think there's a couple of open source projects I saw recently that won technology Emmys, which is really cool. VS Code. Yeah, this is actually a fun one, I think, because VS Code is now open source, I believe, but was not originally, because originally it was Electron, right? And then they bought it and built VS Code on top of it, and then they didn't open source VS Code for a while, and now they have, which is good. TensorFlow, yeah, yep, TensorFlow is a really good example of that. Android, yes. I mean, again, it's similar kind of thing to Chromium. Like, the fact that so many people end up using Android is almost entirely down to the fact that it's an open source platform. React, yep, freaking great, great piece of kit. Everybody wants to use a bit of React. All right, let's move on. We'll cover a little bit of terminology here. Let's cover some top lines. So, for those who are unfamiliar with the open source world, let's run through a couple of bits here. So, maintainers, these are generally considered to be like the owner or like the admin of the project. Generally, they oversee everything. They have a pretty high level of control, and they tend to have like overseeing responsibility for approving things like major version changes or like big pull requests will usually end up going through a maintainer of some kind. Contributors, those are folks who contribute, whether that is code, non-code. We'll talk a little bit later about non-code contributions to projects because I think they're great. And it's a really great way to get involved if you can't write code. Users, folks who use it. If you download open source and shove it in your project, if you're pulling node packages or Go getting or whatever it is that you love, that is an open source. You are an open source user. Congratulations. Licenses, terms and conditions of use and distribution of software. We'll touch a little bit on licenses, I think, because there seems to be a lot of questions in chat about them. So we'll definitely touch on that in a minute. There's a lot of common ones that you'll hear around: GPL v2, v3, MIT. All of those are pretty standard licenses. Code of conduct. This you'll be familiar with it from the MLH side. Open source code of conducts are pretty similar. You are defining community standards, signaling that you are a welcoming and inclusive project, and outlining your procedures for handling abuse. And last but certainly not least, which is my favorite part, is a README. This is a short form of documentation. This is usually the first thing that anybody will see when they load your project up. So, like 90% of the time, it's like the first thing that everybody goes to when they're trying to find something. So you usually want like all of the important links in there and all of the important info to get your project running. Usually you're covering like why the project is useful, what you can do with it, and then how to actually use it, which is always good. So next up, what makes an open source project complete? Well, this is a bit of a relative definition, because in a lot of cases, like, software's never complete. You're always going to find something to build. That's just the way of the world. But if we throw that away for a second, like the main things that I would say you want before you release an open source project onto the world is that you're going to want a license, because that's going to define how people are able to actually use the project. You're going to want a README, because they're going to want to figure out precisely how to use said project and how it's going to work in practice. You're going to want some contributing guidelines, which usually covers how your pull requests are structured. If you specifically want like test coverage writing in, like how the process of adding code to your project should work, so that you're not then having to do more work to then integrate that code once somebody else has written it. And you're going to want a code of conduct, because obviously you are going to need that to define those community standards and make sure that you have the necessary processes in place if somebody does come along and decide to be a bit unhappy with you. So let's talk for a second here about the two fundamental types of open source. there's two generally you might hear these referred to as like FOSS and COS. FOSS I tend to hear a lot around, COS slightly less so. Free open source is really simple. It's your Linuxes. It's freedom to run the thing for any purpose, to study and modify it as you please, and to freely redistribute copies either of the original version or of your modified version. So basically anything goes. You can do whatever the heck you want to it. Classic Linus Torvalds kind of strategy. Everything just rolls. Commercial open source is slightly different. This is usually this is being marketed in a certain kind of way through either selling like merchandise or professional services on top of the open source itself, from providing like hosting services, having some kind of paid license or like an open core, but then having extra bolt-ons that sort of add on top of it. AppWrite is a great example of this. TypeSense, HashiCorp are really well known for doing a lot of this, where they have like for example, you have like Terraform, and then there's like Terraform Cloud, and like the enterprise versions of Terraform that sort of build extra features and functionality on top so that they can support the open source development through those commercial factors, which is always good. All right, next up, non-code contributions. So if you are sort of looking at all of this and you're going, wow, I really want to get involved in open source, but I cannot write code to save my life. There are a million ways that you can get involved. First up, writing. Good technical writing, especially on open source projects, is really, really like valuable. There is so many projects that I know of that would like genuinely like full hand over fist to find really good technical writers. If you're capable of taking technical concepts and like converting them into good writing, you are going to be really valuable to a lot of open source contributions. Design, similarly, if you happen to like design and you've got a project that is focused quite a lot on like UI design elements or has a lot of like UI sections, that could definitely be something to get involved in. Testing and using the thing. If you're using a project a lot and you're like providing feedback, you could potentially consider downloading like beta or early release versions of that, and then providing all of that information back to the project itself can be really, really valuable. Community management. If you happen to love doing community management stuff, basically all open source projects, once they get to a certain scale, are going to need folks to help do that community management piece. So definitely get involved there. And just mentoring. Like a lot of folks, it's just like getting your hands in, talking to other people in the community, lending your expertise. Even if you don't necessarily want to write code, you can explain how a subsystem works if you understand it, or a specific thing that's going on. Those are all really, really valuable ways to get involved. All right, looks like we're right at the end of the slot now. Thank you so much for tuning in, folks. If there are any questions that you happen to have, I'm very happy to take them. I remember there being a couple of things around licenses. There's a really good website for this actually, which I'm going to drop in. Drop in chat if I can find it. Here we are. Love it. It's called choosealicense.com. It's really, really great. And what this does is that you can head on over there, and it will explain to you exactly what each license does, which is pretty helpful when you're trying to figure out precisely what you need to do for your project. Like sometimes if you just want to like let everybody go ham on a project, then like GPL or LGPL v3 is fine. If you specifically want to like limit some stuff down, maybe consider MIT or Apache or the Mozilla public license, which is pretty great. There's lots and lots of options there, which are always really, really good to have handy. Any more questions as we go? Am I in a plane? I'm not in a plane. As a general rule, planes don't tend to have very good Wi-Fi. One day we will get Ryan Swift in a helicopter, and I will do a live stream from there. But unfortunately, that would require a little bit of setup. Any more for anyone? MLH is open source? Yes, we have a GitHub. We have a whole bunch of open source stuff on there. No Light is open source. Some of the websites are open source. There's all kinds of stuff that we open source. So if you head on over to GitHub, you can take a look at all the stuff that we have. All right, looks like that is all the questions that we've had for now. Thank you, folks, so much for coming through. This has been an absolutely wonderful session. I hope that you have all learned a little bit more about the history of open source, what it is that makes up the wonderful open source communities that we have, and a little bit more about the fun terminology that you always end up hearing around the place. I will be around on Discord. If you have any further questions, feel free to catch me there. Otherwise, have a wonderful rest of your weekend and happy hacking.